Okay, so in addition to providing some context for Mendel's life and work, as promised in my subtitle, I would also like to take the time to reflect a bit on why it has been so difficult to contextualize Mendel. As we saw also in Yafeng's talk earlier, historians are still reacting against the received view of Mendel and his rediscovery, a view that has Mendel as a very isolated figure, far away in Moravia, cloistered in his monastery, without intellectual peers or scientific sources and influences, without even readers capable of understanding his paper, if they could even find it in the 19th century, and in need of rediscovery in 1900, when the world was finally ready to read and understand his paper properly. But the old isolation, neglect, and rediscovery story, developed by the rediscoverers themselves and other early Mendelians soon after 1900, has been very resistant to revision, even as new information becomes available about Mendel. So I aim to undo some of that storytelling by the rediscoverers, in a sense to unrediscover Mendel, so that we can discover him anew, give him a context and a community or communities. But let's begin with some basic facts about Mendel's life and career. He was born in 1822, either on July 22nd or on July 20th, depending on who you believe, the church baptismal records or his mother's recollections. It was in a village known as Heinzendorf to its German-speaking residents, Hünčice in Czech, in a mixed German and Czech-speaking region of Moravia, then part of the Habsburg Empire, now in the Czech Republic. His parents were peasants, better off than most of their neighbors because they owned their house and their fields. But they could still ill afford to send their only son away for an education. There were no secondary schools anywhere near the village. Nonetheless, Mendel did get through gymnasium and 2 years of university level studies before opting to take holy orders. His motives for the holy orders are disputed. Clearly, he needed the financial security, but was that all? Or did he genuinely feel called to it? The early Mendelians preferred to believe that it was purely a financial decision, and that monastic life could only have been a hindrance to his scientific work. In any case, he was accepted into the Augustinian Abbey in Brno, or Brünn as it was known in German, as a novice in 1843. For the next 4 years, he studied theology in Brno. He also took a year-long course on agriculture, which the Augustinians required of all their novices so that they could better understand the local agrarian economy and possibly also help manage the extensive land holdings of the abbey. In 1847, he finished his theological studies and was ordained a priest. Thereafter, far from living a cloistered existence, he was deeply involved in community service, as were all the other friars. Mendel was initially assigned to minister to the sick and give last rites to the dying at the local hospital. But he was so upset by the experience that he fell ill himself and was hospitalized for a month. So they decided to try him out as a school teacher instead, and he was very good at that. And there was a lot of demand for teachers at that time, particularly at the gymnasium, and particularly science and math teachers, because of educational reforms that were instituted following the revolutions of 1848. He failed his first attempt at the licensing exam, however, not surprising for someone who was almost entirely self-taught in his chosen subject area, the natural sciences. His abbot didn't give up on him and his teaching, but sent him to Vienna for proper preparation at the university there. That was from 1851 to 1853. Among his instructors in Vienna was Franz Unger, the cell biologist, biogeographer, and paleobotanist. Despite failing his licensing exam on his second try in 1854, Mendel was hired to teach anyway upon his return to Brno in 1854. And he taught at the new Realschule. That was the modernized gymnasium with less Latin and more science. Technically, he was only a supply teacher and was restricted to teaching only the lower classes. Also in 1854, he began his pilot studies of peas and presumably planned his famous experiments. In 1856, he began those experiments in earnest. While he was working on the peas in 1862, local interest in the sciences had been growing, and a group split off from the local agricultural society to form a general scientific society, the Naturforschenden Verein, or Society of Naturalists in Brno. It met at Mendel's school, and many of its members were Mendel's fellow teachers or Augustinian friars. Mendel gave his famous paper at the Realschule in 1865, and the printed version appeared in the Proceedings of the Brunn Society in the volume for 1865. Sometimes the date is given as 1866 because publication was delayed by a year because of the Austro-Prussian War, but the inside date is 1865. In 1868, Mendel was elected abbot, which ended his teaching career and took time away from his scientific interests, but did not entirely end them. In 1869, he published one last article on hybridization, the article on the hawkweeds, and he continued to publish on other subjects that interested him, mostly meteorology, but also sunspots, epidemiology, and beekeeping. He died in 1884. And in 1900 came his rediscovery, following a period that Conway Zirkel named the Great Neglect. So unlike Mendel's paper, after 1900, Mendel the person became known only gradually. The rediscoverers and other early Mendelians, such as William Bateson, started telling Mendel's story anyway, based on limited data and sometimes inaccurate data, also on first impressions and projections. They projected their conceptions of a 20th century Western European secular professional scientist onto Mendel, and assumed that he must have been isolated at in a monastery in faraway Moravia. So now I want to turn to some of the first impressions that were received and given of Mendel, starting with the visual impressions established by the first published photos of Mendel and how they were copied and embellished. Here's the frontispiece to Bateson's 1902, Mendel's Principles of Heredity, a Defense. It's a photograph that he says was kindly supplied by the very Reverend Dr. Janicek, the present abbot. Evidently, Bateson had written to the abbey for information, but the response in the photo came not from the abbot, but from one of the friars who was old enough to have known Mendel. The photo is undated, but probably from 1868 and the occasion of Mendel's election as abbot. But it's possibly later. Bateson thought it was from 1880. But in my opinion, Mendel's hairline has not receded enough from the 1862 levels, and it's probably an older date. In any case, it's generally accepted that he was abbot already in this picture. And it's interesting that he chose not to pose in his full religious regalia, just the big crucifix. But as abbot, he also held the rank of prelate, the same level as a bishop, and was given a coat of arms and the bishop's mitre and staff. Bateson obscured the religious attributes further by giving the photo an oval outline that obscured half of the crucifix. And that might have been in the spirit of Mendel's original decision to pose in plain clothes, but it also expresses the puzzlement of the early Mendelians about Mendel's religious commitments and how they could be compatible with his science. The power of these visual representations to detract from Mendel's clerical side was not lost on the Augustinians back in Brno. And they commissioned a painted portrait based on this photo with the religious attributes added in. But it's the more secular view of Mendel that has won out, and I think it was, I think it made a difference that Bateson publicized this version of Mendel's image. In Bateson's second edition, he got rid of the religion entirely. He chose a new photo for the frontispiece that has more botany in it and less religion. This is the 1909 edition of Bateson's book. And it's a photo that he says was enlarged from a group of the brethren of the Königskloster. It's a detail of a group photo, and the unfortunate friar seated at Mendel's elbow had to be painted over. And the oval outline that Bateson provided helps cover that up. Here's a higher quality version of the picture, the square version, showing more of the repainted sleeve. This picture too is undated, but it's thought to be from around 1862. Notice the fuchsia flower in Mendel's hand. Why is he posing with a fuchsia? Isn't he supposed to be immersed in the pea experiments just then? It's 1862. He's also involved in the founding of the scientific society. Why not pose as the pea researcher and holding a pea plant instead? Perhaps Mendel was trying to tell us something about himself. Perhaps that his fuchsia breeding meant more to him than the pea experimentation. He had won a prize for his ornamental plant breeding. That image of Mendel with the fuchsia has become iconic and is often reproduced. Here it is on the cover of a recent book on Mendel. It's often ignored. The fuchsia is often ignored or mistaken for a pea. I've seen versions of this picture captioned as Mendel with pea plant. After all, that makes more sense under the received view. It shows, and this shows how the practical side of Mendel can be obscured. Over time, the fuchsia even becomes a pea. Here's a version of that image on an Austrian postage stamp from 1984, the 100th anniversary of Mendel's death. And sometimes the pea even grows. Here's one I found just recently from a 200th birthday commemoration in Munich, The pea is growing and flourishing under Mendel's green thumb. And here at last is the source of the picture, showing what was obscured in all those other renditions of the photo, Mendel in his context, among the other Augustinians. They are Mendel's intellectual community within the monastery. Notice how they were all trying to not look alike in their black robes. They're trying to strike individual poses and to express individual interests, several of them with books representing their scholarly interests. Several of them are school teachers or teach at the university level. And in this context, Mendel is telling us which one he is. He's the one who breeds prize-winning fuchsias. Turning now from the imagery to the text, consider this quote from biologist historian Conway Zirkel, who gave us the term great neglect. He wrote, "We have only to read Mendel's paper to see how much further he saw into the nature of heredity than did any of his contemporaries." I hope you can see what is wrong with this attitude, that if we only read Mendel's paper, we don't actually learn much of anything about Mendel's contemporaries. And not that Zirkel failed to read Mendel's contemporaries, quite the contrary. He was an authority on pre-Mendelian heredity. But he knew even before he read those other papers that they were going to be inferior scientists and were only of interest if they anticipated some finding of Mendel's. He had been dazzled by his first reading of Mendel's paper and never deviated from his first impressions. Though the quote is from 1951, it represents a common view that dates back to 1900, and even as late as 1996, it's quoted approvingly by Vyacheslav Orel in his biography of Mendel, even used as an epigraph of the first chapter. Now, if we can set aside the received story of isolation, neglect, and rediscovery, what can we replace it with? Mendel himself gives us several clues to his intellectual community and his sources, by holding up the fuchsia in the picture, for example, but it's also in the text of his famous paper. And there are three such communities that I want to highlight. The practical plant and animal breeders, the experimental hybridizers, who are distinguishable from the breeders because they're posing more theoretical questions about the nature of the hybrids, the nature of species, and what happens to the descendants of hybrids, that is, their development or Entwicklung. And third, the biogeographers and paleobotanists. Here's a prominent clue that Mendel gives us. This is the very first page and first sentence of Mendel's paper. He begins with his debt to plant breeding. Artificial pollinations done on ornamental plants, aiming for new color varieties, gave the idea for the experiments to be discussed here. It's ornamental plants. The whole series of experiments was inspired by the fuchsia breeding. And his quest was not just for general improvement in the appearance of the plants, but specific characteristics, in this case, the color varieties. He has the breeder's way of looking at a plant and analyzing it into a list of characteristics. On the same page, in the very next paragraph, Mendel shows us his connection to the experimental plant hybridizers, and he names them. Careful observers such as Kohlreuter, Gärtner, Herbert, Lecoq, Vicura, among others, have sacrificed part of their lives to this task with tireless endurance. That is to the task of following the evolution or development of the hybrids over multiple generations to see if they breed true or change in predictable ways. And last but not least, the connection to biogeography and paleobotany. Mendel does not name his sources for us, but they are revealed in his methods of categorizing and counting his plants and calculating ratios. It was a method not unique to Mendel. It was common practice in field studies of species distribution and succession. These studies aimed to discover quantitative patterns and laws that reflected interdependencies between species. The biogeographers characterized a flora by categorizing and counting the species that they found in it and calculating the ratios between the various species counts. Using such ratios, they could quantify and track changes in the composition of the flora over geographic space or geological time. Here's an example from Alexander von Humboldt, who pioneered the method. He's characterizing the northern temperate forest. Each row in his table is a major taxonomic group of plants. The Glumaceae at the top is an obsolete name for the monocots, and they make up 1/8 of the species he collected. Within the monocots, the grass is made up 1/12 of the sample. Similarly, for the composites, legumes, and other orders, they make up 1/8, 1/16, and so on of the total. More closely connected to Mendel, here's Franz Unger, applying the same method to his fossil plants. The rows are his 7 divisions of the plant kingdom: algae, mosses, monocots, gymnosperms, and 3 obsolete subgroups of the dicots. The columns are his 7 geological periods, and in the boxes, the percentages of the species in each division in each geological period. Thus, he can show that the composition of the world's flora changes from period to period. Unger argues generally that the more complex plants appear later. Algae are always around, mosses dominate relatively early, peaking in the Silurian Devonian, and Carboniferous at 80 and 81%. Gymnosperms begin to take over in the Jurassic and Cretaceous with 38 and 21%, and so on. This is all quantifiable and suggests to Unger that there are laws of distribution and evolution or development. He doesn't have a separate word for evolution. It's all Entwicklung to him. Unger's book came out in 1852, just when Mendel was in Vienna taking courses with him. This method must have appealed to Mendel, his interest in quantification, law, categorizing, and counting, and change over time. And this connection goes against the idea that botany was not quantitative, or that only a Mendel could have thought of counting and classifying his plants, or that Mendel was using such difficult and unfamiliar mathematics that botanists could not follow it until after 1900. Turning now to the story of the Great Neglect, I would like to point out what should be obvious, that the rediscoverers all found Mendel's paper in a book, not by means of archaeology or by rummaging through rubbish bins. They went to the library and consulted the standard literature on hybridization. At least two of them, possibly all three, checked the authoritative compendium on plant hybrids by Wilhelm Focke from 1881. Admittedly, Focke did not come out and say, hey, look, here's the foundation for a new science of heredity. But he was paying attention to the literature. He included Mendel's paper, made Mendel's basic findings known. His emphasis was on the claimed numerical regularities of Mendel's, and he was skeptical about the generalizability of Mendel's rules into universal laws. He did not say much of it or anything about Mendel's hypothetical hereditary particles. Mendel is also known to have ordered 40 off-prints of his paper from the printer, and these were circulating, probably mostly among plant breeders. And one of them found its way to Rediscoverer de Vries. So the informal network was also paying attention to Mendel. Since 1900, the number of known 19th century references to Mendel has increased steadily. So how lost was the paper really? And how remarkable is it that three more botanists found it in an obvious book in 1900? So to sum up, Mendel was not isolated. Brno and the Abbey actually had a lot of advantages for Mendel as a researcher. The Augustinians appreciated and encouraged scholarly endeavors. They took an interest in new scientific approaches to agriculture and plant breeding. They provided Mendel with a well-stocked research library, gardens and greenhouses. Also a free education, including at the University of Vienna. And outside the Abbey, there was the local Society of Naturalists and his fellow teachers. He had learned company who were interested in the kind of work he was doing. Mendel portrayed himself mainly as a plant breeder, and he obviously drew inspiration from his fuchsias. He also named his sources and inspirations from experimental plant hybridization, and he borrowed methods from biogeography and paleobotany. So for example, he analyzed forms, plant forms, into lists of characteristics, like many of the breeders. He used hybridization to get desired characteristics from different varieties to recombine in a hybrid, again, like many breeders before him, and like Biffen and Chermak after him. He classified, counted, and calculated ratios like Unger and Humboldt. And he performed multi-generational experiments. He followed his pea hybrids for 6 generations in most of the experiments, like the hybridizers, following the long-term development or evolution of the hybrids. So there's an emerging view of Mendel's achievement, not as a stroke of insight coming out of nowhere, but as a synthesis of multiple lines of research. Finally, concerning the rediscovery of the paper, though the mere rereading of the paper is becoming less remarkable, the more 19th century references to Mendel are found, something did happen in 1900 that hadn't happened before, namely the rapid growth of genetics as a discipline. So I'd like to suggest, therefore, that we view the rediscovery as more of a reinterpretation of Mendel's paper for a new generation of readers, a new community, and new purposes. They paid greater attention to Mendel's subcellular hereditary particles than to his supposed laws. And they obscured Mendel's old connections to the breeders and hybridizers, biogeographers and Augustinians, and claimed him instead for development, cytology, evolution, and a new science of heredity. Thank you.